any competition for scarce resources leads to oligarchy. Why? Because it's a game, and every iteration of the game, somebody is more lucky or more clever than you. So they already have more resources for the second game and then the third game. And so whether it's land or money, you see it, that is always this tendency towards oligarchy.
Well, thank you so much, Michel, for joining me. You don't quite know it, but your ideas and the Peer-to-Peer Foundation wiki was very transformative in my thinking. I think I came across it around sort of 2006, 2007 when I was looking at
Wow,
the Pirate
that
Party.
was right at the beginning.
Yeah. I was very much in the sort of like file sharing side of peer-to-peer networks, but coming across the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and what they were doing with the Pirate Party, I kind of started realizing the broader scope of peer-to-peer technologies, peer production, and the notion of a public good and building these as these protocols and these networks as public goods is something that's stayed with me since, and I've been trying to kind of build that out. So that's like one reason. Also, another reason I'd like to speak with you is, you've talked about the network society. You've been very concerned with civilizational transitions, as I understand it, and
Right.
I'm very much about this notion of cyber states and so on. So yeah, I guess before we get into any of that, would you like to introduce yourself?
All right. So my name is obviously Michel Bauwens. I'm from Belgium originally. I would say, unfortunately, I'm 66. Starts to count, and I live in northern Thailand, in Chiang Mai, which last week was the most polluted city in the world, but which I nevertheless recommend outside of these hazing months, which is like March to May. It's quite a wonderful place to live normally, and it's one of the places where the number of digital nomads is very, very high. And used to be Westerners, now it's like a lot of Chinese people are coming here. So the last few meetings of digital nomads that I attended were like full of Asian people from India, from Pakistan, from everywhere. So it's, you kind of feel the shift also in the zeitgeist and in the vibe. De-Westernization is in the air. What else would I say? Yeah, so I founded a peer-to-peer foundation. I took a 2 year sabbatical in 2002, 2003, which was the purpose was to study transitions. And I came to the conclusion that before you have, really radical transformations like revolutions and stuff, that this is really only the last stage, and it only happens when society cannot adapt peacefully. Then you need something more violent to shake its foundations. But that mostly, what's of importance is seed forms. So the way you should imagine it. I know this is already outside of self-presentation,
No, this is
but the
great.
way you should imagine it. So you have a relatively stable system, that has solved some basic societal issue, and that has a set of institutions that, as it has solved its institutions, creates its own problems, as it were, which can no longer be solved with that solution. And so at that point, people start quitting, either voluntarily because they have like an anticipatory consciousness, or because they have to, because the old system no longer provides what they need and expect. And so these seed forms are experimentations in a new logic, which eventually will find each other, create subsystems, and eventually be strong enough to transform the whole civilization. So that's the way I look at the world. And so, of course, right now I look at the world at around two specific things, which is peer to peer, which is the capacity for trans-local self-organization. So that's you have peer to peer in a tribal environment with a small village, and people can solve their issues by talking to their family members, mostly because that's what tribes were about kinship. I'm talking about what we are doing here, and all the systems that go with it. So the fact that people can join ecosystems of collaboration which transcend pure geography. Um, and that's not to say that's the only reality, but that is certainly to say that this will change the old reality, and that I think this is civilizational because civilization was actually a relation between agriculture and the city. So it's the surplus of agriculture allows you to create a new class, a writing class, and which was a minority, and the writing class created markets and states, to kind of upscale from tribal arrangements. And I think we're reaching a new pivot. So I think this is actually more like a 5,000 year shift rather than just like a 50-year shift or even 500-year shift. I think we are moving towards this new form of mutual coordination. So distributed coordination by peers, but to do that they need commons. So this is the second concept. So the second concept is commons, which is shared resources that are managed or created or defended by a community or a group of stakeholders using their own regulation. And so that immediately distinguishes from the market and the state. So,
Mm.
without saying or expecting that they will disappear anytime soon, I do think that we are creating this new sphere. So I don't know if you know Mark Stallman from the Center for the Study of Digital Life. He has a good way to, he says you have East and West, and now you have digital. So you have this kind of
Right.
like, market-centric versus state-centric competition between the West and the Russia-China axis and the BRICS on, mostly allied now with them. So that's like the struggle in the geosphere. But then we have a new layer and we come with our own solutions. And then, of course, there's a big debate, and maybe we can have that debate whether the purely libertarian solution is the solution, or whether it's something else, or some kind of hybrid adaptation between the earlier layer, physical layer, and this new layer. So that's the whole debate. I think that is of interest. Is like, where are we going? And so if you study civilization, I will stop. I promise. And especially civilization transition to the past, I think this gives you a lot of patterns that without saying they will be repeated in the same way, it still allows you to think like, what if, right? What if this pattern is now also operative in this transition, and how would it be different once we have the digital? So that's the kind of what I use to
Yeah.
stimulate my thinking. I look at the end of Rome, and like medieval, I love medieval society, Western medieval society. I think it's a very
Right.
good image of a distributed system. It was full of
Definitely.
contracts, as not digital contracts, but it was contract-based society,
Hmm.
very local, but at the same time a unified culture through the monks and the Catholic Church. And again, I'm not saying this to say we're going towards the same, but I think it's very useful to study patterns of the past and see if they apply or not, and whether they are transformed or not, and how they are transformed, and whether there's new things that didn't exist before. But it helps you see the present, especially because we are in a presentist moment, right, where people can't see anything, like it's chaos. So and they can't project themselves. That's very dangerous, right?
Definitely.
If you
Yeah.
cannot project yourself, and there's basically two ways to deal with that. One is transcendence. You become spiritual, and you choose a vertical dimension, and you kind of like move away from the world in a certain way. Or you can have a horizontal transcendence, which is like to have a long enough view that you can project yourself beyond the catastrophe, which every civilization transition also is. So, and that can give you strength and hope. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with my narratives about peer-to-peer in the commons.
Right. Nice. I mean, thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack, and I'd love to get into. Um, so I guess like when it comes to this sort of like 5,000 year shift, um, uh, where are we in that sort of period, I guess, in your mind? Like if we bring this to like a more concrete, like I assume that you think we're
Right.
undergoing this civilizational shift.
Yeah.
And then like what is the agriculture equivalent we're talking about here? Is
Right.
this the net, or how, or
Okay.
just
So
instantaneous
let me
communication?
say a bit about cycles, maybe first.
Sure.
So, so what I believe is that we are in a concatenation of cycles. I hope that's a good English word. What I mean is that
Yeah.
a lot of cycles, which are in the descending phase, are coming together and making the crisis very intense.
Hmm.
So we have a Kondratieff cycle. This is the cycle of the political economy, which is about 50 years. Has a upswing, peak, and downswing, and then a sudden systemic crisis. This is
Hmm.
rather easy, I think, to pinpoint because started in 45. We had an upswing. The middle was 73. We had the oil crisis and everything, and I think definitely 2008 was the end of it. Was when the whole that system kind of crashed. Then
So
there
wait,
is a
when we're
100-year
talking,
cycle,
sorry
right?
to interrupt you there, but like when we're talking about these cycles, are you talking about it in like a sort of Spengler, Toynbee, Burnham kind of
Yeah, but they
sense?
have long. I'll come to it. They have long cycles. So I'm
Okay, okay,
starting with the
sorry. Yeah.
small ones, and I get to the longer ones. So
Okay,
the short is on average 50 years. But when you say 50, it can be 60 or 40
sure.
or but
Yeah,
and it's
some
like
standard deviation.
it's a
Yeah.
political economy system. So and you can we had two phases before the peak, the welfare state, and then after the peak, the neoliberal system,
Hmm.
and then that crashed in 2008. So there we are in the chaotic transition of the political economy cycle and seeking a new combination of energy and work organization and all of that. But then there is the 100-year cycle, which is described in the fourth generation book, right, where you have a first generation after the crisis rebuild society. 25 years, one generation. The second generation, 68, starts revolting against the system already. The third phase is when they're both on the same level of strength. So the old and the new are like in the 90s. And then the fourth generation cycle is when you enter chaos. And so that's a civic cycle. It pertains to civic institutions like the trust in democracy. We can
Hmm.
clearly see, it's largely gone.
Very
People don't
eroded.
trust the press, don't trust the media. That's not an economic issue. That's a civic issue. Like, how do we organize ourselves politically? And of course, they're
Yeah.
related, but and
And what
but also
shreds remain
seeing,
of that generative AI is going to completely ruin as
yeah,
well,
you
right?
can, yes. So then you have, you can see that the war cycle and the hegemony cycle are also 100 years, are related to that second cycle. And what happens is every 100 years there's a big war. Think Napoleon, World War One, World War Two, and now you can feel it. We're going back to a
Yeah.
very unstable period with Ukraine, Gaza, and this is just in the last 2 years. And who knows? Iran could get involved, and the Houthis, and and China and
Could
Taiwan. I
escalate.
mean, it's not it's getting very unstable, right?
Mm.
And so hegemonic means like a change of hegemon, right?
Mhm.
The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, they had actually two cycles and the American cycle. And I think it's very likely that the American hegemony is going down, which is very dangerous because, it's like a wounded tiger, if you're
Yeah.
that's when you're most
Crashing in
dangerous.
its last throes.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So then so now Toynbee and Spengler, they are about long cycles. And
Mm.
it's 1,000 year and 500 years. So basically, you could have this kind of idea that you know. So you have chaos. Out of that comes a civilization.
Hmm.
Eventually, creates cities, and they're decentralized. Right. Eventually, they start fighting to each other and creating
Yeah.
alliances against each other, and eventually they exhausted themselves. So that's what happened to Greece. I think around the fourth century BC,
Hmm.
and that's what happened to Italy in the 14th century. Right. So when you reach that 500-year stage of a civilization, the second phase is a centralizing phase of civilization. Now, in Europe, because England was always destroying the would be empires, we have a very special system, which is the nation state. So we never got a true empire, but nation states are also centralizing, agents, right? They centralize in a smaller area, but then they unite in an international system, and which was clearly dominated by the U.S. since the 1940s. So I would say we are also at the end of a 1,000-year cycle of Western civilization, because that started more or less in 998 with the German Holy Roman Empire, which restored a kind of integrative dynamic, because between 500 and 1,000 it's chaos. It's a dark age. So it's only when the Holy Roman Empire established itself that you get, like the growth of the High Middle Ages, and so that 500 period collapses in 1500.
Mm.
It's a longer process, but that basically creates the conditions for the nation state system, which again, has different iterations. And I think that is ending now, right? So that's
Absolutely.
500 and 1,000 year. And then the 5,000 year is the idea that civilization was an agrarian, a rural-urban relationship. And, which can also then go into complications, but let's stay simple, that we now have this new layer, the translocal layer, of self-organized translocal communities, right? And then,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't mind, I can historicize that a little bit. So I think
Sure.
93 is a key date, because we democratized the digital.
Right.
Before 93, it's used by companies, big governments, but citizens have no access to it. So in 93 is like the explosion after the web and the browser,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then open source, and I'm not sure what date to put on open source, but open source, why is this important? It's the first time we can coordinate human labor at a global scale outside of corporations and states. So, small groups of on average 5 people can create a coalition of 25,000 workers with 500 companies involved and create Linux,
Yeah.
right? So
And
this,
run on
but
billions of devices and the backbone of
exactly,
basically
yeah.
the
So
internet.
and the market and state cannot even do that on their own. So without
No.
the open source commons, no state or company is actually able to do it by themselves. And okay, then crypto comes in, which is the second layer, because I think the problem with open source was that we couldn't fund the core of the commons.
Yeah.
So the people who
Yeah.
are interfacing with the market, could get money for certification, education, improving, adaptation. But the people working for the core had to be subsidized by big multinationals.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem of open source is it's under heavy influence of big companies that are very influential in the core of these open source developments. And so crypto is interesting because it allows for the financing of that open source work in the core. And so now you see Ethereum, funding public goods. So taxing itself, as it were, right? Optimism, you pay double the cost of maintaining and growing that I don't know how you call it, like a chain or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
Uh, and they give it to Gitcoin, and Gitcoin then funds the commons of Ethereum,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is extraordinarily significant because we have so the capacity now from within the network to finance your own commons. Now, I think there's still, a big problem, and which I will explain right now, which is the relationship. So I still think crypto is incomplete because it doesn't deal with real production, right?
Right.
So when you look at declining civilizations, let me give you very quickly the end of Rome. So Rome is a slave-based system, right? You conquer, you get slaves and booty and gold, and then you pay the soldiers with that booty. When
Mm-hmm.
you can no longer conquer, now you have to start paying your soldiers. So you have to start taxing, right? Then the landlords have to pay the tax. But as the system declines, the people leave the cities and look for to go back to the countryside to be closer to food production. And they start, putting pressure on the landlords to pay them, to lower the rents. So then the Roman state says we're going to make them colony, force them to stay on the land so that the landlords can pay their taxes. So that's the beginning of feudalism already within the
Right.
as a root within the Roman Empire, right? So what I'm saying is, and so what you also have to understand is that at the end of the Roman Empire, there was no more money. Like
Right.
literally, the monetary system collapsed. So you go back to food. So I'm a farmer. You're the landlord. I give you, half of my food production, and so you can pay soldiers that will protect me.
Right.
That's the social contract of
Yeah.
feudalism. And so my critique of crypto is that if you just think that you can do like an exodus of the old system and then do an arbitrage between nation states, and if Portugal collapses, we go to Greece. If Greece collapses, we go to the Canary Islands. At
Right.
some point it will bite you in the ass because
Yeah.
some
You're
people
not if you're
say
not producing
we
anything
we
of your
don't want
own.
these parasites. We don't want
Yeah.
these parasites. We
Yeah.
and so I think crypto should get involved in physical production, in reorganizing physical production, in creating what I call mutual coordination economics with your own supply chains. Okay, this is another topic. I can go into it, but okay, I feel I
I
want
have
you
so
to
many
react.
questions, and like there's a bunch of things that I want to unpack. This is great stuff. I guess are you familiar with Bertrand de Jouvenel, who did the book on
Yeah,
power?
yeah, I read.
Yeah,
I read it. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah,
because I guess like one of my questions is, and it certainly comes up, after the fall of Rome, in his examples, basically how things start to re-centralize. I don't know if you have
right.
any ideas around like why that has, or if you agree with,
Yes.
some of his
So
ideas.
okay,
Or
so let me explain Spengler because he sheds light on this. So
Mhm,
um, a civilization is a mixture at first.
mhm,
You have an invader and a local population. And that's
mhm,
why you have to go beyond custom because both have their own customs. And now they're together, they have to reinvent society in order to live together, right? And so essentially, you have a warrior class, which is the invading class, and a priestly class which tries to civilize the warriors because you need almost psychopaths to go to war, but then of course when they come home they do the same and they rape the women, and so to have a civilization you need both. You need the warriors and the priests, and the priests are there to soften
yeah, like a
the
regulating function,
system
civil.
of the
Yeah,
warriors, right? So
yeah,
eventually they're successful, they create a surplus, and you get cities. So the
mhm,
cities create a third class, which is the merchant class and the guilds and stuff, right? So this is where you get the Jouvenel, because what he notices is that, and this is not like Marx who only sees two, dialectics, and Jouvenel sees trialectics, right? He sees
mhm,
bottom, middle, and top. And so what
yep,
Jouvenel says is that the top will mobilize the bottom against the middle, right? So
right,
the cities and the kings will ally against the aristocracy, and inevitably will actually abolish the caste system eventually. And it happens in every
right,
civilization, not just in the West. Byzantium, China, Spengler really documents that this is a very universal pattern, right? So then in the cities, as they grow bigger and bigger, you create a fourth class, he says, which is the working class, and they want democracy, and they'll get democracy, but democracy is corrupted by money, and eventually that will collapse as well. And then you get what he calls Caesarism.
mm,
And I think there's very good grounds to say that we are now entering a Caesarist period.
right.
Figures like Trump.
I was going to
So
say that. Yeah.
people, yeah. So if you talk to people who like Trump, it's not that they like everything he is or does, but they say we need a crazy guy like that just to be a bull in a
Yeah.
china shop, because otherwise
Reset this
nothing is going to change
exactly.
for us, right? And because the system is so stuck, so you get these figures coming out and they do the arbitrage between the people,
Mm,
right? So what a Caesar can do is say, oh, I'll give this to the working class, and I'll give this to the capitalists, and I'll give this to the church. And because they are in a how do you say this in English, like a pat situation where nobody can win, right? The
Yeah.
Reds and the Blues in the US,
Stalemate. Yeah.
they can't win. It's a stalemate. So then you can have a figure coming out who can decide who to favor, and if this side comes too strong, he'll support for a while the other side, right? So that's what a Caesar usually does. Is somebody who allies with the poor, and then changes the system and gives enough to the poor so that they're happy with him.
Yeah.
Peron, Napoleon, they are figures like that, and I think Trump is
Yeah.
probably has the potential to be a figure like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, thanks for that. I guess so one of the things that we talked about crypto and how this improves the open source dynamics, and building these sort of public goods. But like in the light of this, I've kind of been a little bit concerned in the way that I've been viewing, blockchain networks, because I'm starting to view them more like social orders, and the consensus algorithm much more like a form of popular sovereignty in a way. And I can imagine this order being the backbone or basis for a cyber state, virtual state, temporary autonomous zone, network state, whatever you want to call it. And so then, like when we start talking about funding of these public goods, it's almost like a developmental state in that it is investing heavily in infrastructure, but that patronage is also kind of a centralizing force because it creates this strong dependency. So unless we build out token economics and mechanisms for these various public goods to be self-sustaining, I could see maybe in I don't know which cycle it would be, 50 or 100 years time, that a crypto SAR comes up and aligns.
I think you should actually see it that way in a way, right? Because we can't be fully utopian. So because nature, is cyclic and human culture is cyclic. And so here's my view. So any competition for scarce resources leads to oligarchy.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's a game, and every iteration of the game, somebody is more lucky or more clever than you. So they already have more resources for the second game and then the third game. And so whether it's land or money, you see it, that is always this tendency towards oligarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you either react to it violently. So that's actually, few people know that, but Greek democracy was a revolution against the landed aristocracy, which was, lending out money at high interest, and that's what created Greek democracy as a revolt against, the self-enslaving by the landlords. And then the way to maintain it is by having anti-oligarchic measures, right? And so again, I'm happy to see I think quadratic funding and quadratic voting. I'm not very technical, and I'm not sure exactly how they work, but I think they seem to me to be anti-oligarchic efforts, right? To balance contribution with the, let's say, the investor tokens, and give more power to people who contribute to the network itself. So I think to the degree that we can find these like balancing measures, we can maintain, the systems longer. Will it be forever? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't expect it, because in the past we haven't been able to do it either. Look at like medieval cities. They were self-organized,
Mm-hmm.
run by the guilds, and only later, did the merchant guilds dominate, and then out of the merchant guilds came these families that started
Mm-hmm.
dominating the whole city, like the Medici and right. It took a while, but there's a long period where maybe 150 years, half a 300 years cycle, where we had very democratic run cities. 98% of the people in the Middle Ages were in the cities were member of associations, fraternities, with their own judiciary and everything. So I hope you can see that there's some parallels there with the way the crypto world is
Absolutely.
developing, right? Except that they're not
Yeah, I mean,
territorial
DAOs are
cities;
kind of
they're
like
like
guilds, you know.
Yeah, and you
Uh,
actually have now, they call themselves guilds, like the
yeah.
Protocol Guild and stuff. So this kind of tendency towards distribution and decentralization, which you see in crypto, is kind of creating similar phenomena than when we were creating these decentralized city systems. But again, we'll have to see whether we can go out of the cycle or not. To some degree, I think this is the real challenge, actually. Okay, and here I have to be optimistic. So I'll give you a big scheme. I like schemes. So here's another one. So nature created, or God, if you like, created an immature biosphere,
Mhm.
right? And then you had something called the Great Oxygenation Event, which was poisonous, but then actually created a mature biosphere eventually. So you had, based on oxygen and what some people call Gaia, but it's scientific now. It's called Earth System Science, which is it's actually a system that tries to maintain itself. It's mysterious, we but they have identified many feedback systems that recreate order when there is chaos and disorder, right? So then we come. So nature creates culture, right? Through
Right.
humanity creates a new layer. So you have the geosphere, the biosphere of life, and then the noosphere of human culture. And what we create is an immature technosphere, right? Which is eating the biosphere and eating the geosphere in an unsustainable way. So the big
Mm.
challenge for me is, can we move from an immature technosphere to a mature technosphere, right? And I think this is the big challenge. This is the big transition. And if we succeed in that, then maybe we can live for thousands of years in balance with the planet. I think that's the great hope, right? And so where does crypto come in? I think crypto creates a planetary scale mutual coordination economy, but I
Yep.
call it cosmolocal, because why do we need to be local? Because two-thirds of the expenditure of matter and energy is actually transporting now. And that's way too much. Like, there's very good butter in Patagonia, but they're getting bankrupt by the New Zealand butter, right?
Right.
There's no need for that.
Absurd.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's absurd, right? Or you think about shrimp. They're fished in New England. They're sent to China, and then they come back.
Yeah.
Same thing here. The apples go to China and then they come back. Um, so there is a lot enormous waste because we are fixated on money, and money doesn't give us the right signals about thermodynamic realities, right? And so
Right.
there's a lot of things in crypto that are potential solutions to this. So the first thing is the actual ability to coordinate production on a global scale. So we relocalize, we mutualize certain things because it's cheap to do certain things collectively. But then we have the layer of the noosphere, which is cosmic, right? What is heavy is local, and what is light is global. And so I always say to the localist that localism is sublinear. You lose efficiency if you're only local,
Hmm.
but cosmolocal is superlinear. We gain efficiency by combining the local with the cosmic, right? So relocalized production, but global cooperation. And so you asked me how long, the crisis can last. So one of the answers is this: it used to take 4 generations. I don't
Hmm.
think we have 4 generations. So our hope is the acceleration of technology, and that's where
Mm.
AI comes in. For me, not as some mystical intelligence is going to take over, but as something that is going to be like a tool that is going to tell us the limits of what we can spend for humanity, right? So I see a first layer of stigmergic coordination. So because of open source and crypto, we can see the whole ecosystem. So
Hmm.
we move from a situation where you have competing states and markets which can only see their own thing. Am I making more profit? Am I getting enough taxes? they never see the impact, the externalities. Now we have a universal ledger, the blockchain,
Mhm.
where, and so this is a fourth layer. You have markets, states, non-profits. We're creating an integrative meta layer of coordination of those three sectors, plus all the free contributors that can also join a collaborative ecosystem. And it's cosmolocal. It works both for the local and for the universal level. So because I think we need it. So we need planetary without having a world government. And I think that's where
Yeah. So
commons-based networks are are the equivalent of a world government based on states.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I've come to some similar conclusions and parallels, but from a slightly different angle. Um, so, and more from a technical way, and like how you can retain these sort of utilities and properties of what we love about Bitcoin and Ethereum. Um, and one example in terms of the US's potential decline, and its position as being effectively the de facto peacekeeper for the planet, and consequently the US dollar being essentially the world reserve currency, right? But through its overuse of economic sanctions, you're finding BRICS countries are now starting to create alternate swap lines to circumvent the US dollar effectively.
Right.
And within that, there's a call for the notion of political neutrality in a world reserve currency. Like this would be a highly
Right.
desired property,
Which the West
right?
unfortunately is that I mean that makes me angry that they when
Yeah,
they freeze Russian assets, right? You're telling the
yeah,
world you cannot trust the Western financial system.
yeah,
When you are
exactly.
bombing, the Nord Stream, you're telling the world, oh, it's okay to destroy physical infrastructure.
Yeah,
I mean,
uh,
the West have set very bad precedents, which I
absolutely.
think comes from the panic of the US of losing its hegemony, and it's willing to do everything to keep it, but it's in many ways counterproductive.
I agree. And so, like with this idea in mind, and I was also reading. I think it's called "Is the International Legal Order Unraveling," which is done by I want to say the American Law Institute. I could be wrong on the publisher on that and the
I'm gonna
title,
take a note of
but
that because yeah,
um, it is a set of American lawyers who work in international law, and they start looking at all the different aspects of how world order has changed over certainly
right,
post World War II. But like what these sort of vertical and horizontal rules and how they're being treated. And so like if you view blockchain uh, that is as politically neutral as possible, and in my view, this includes private network level privacy as well as private transactions are almost necessary to maintain that. Uh, if you have that in place, then it actually becomes like a great order for this global coordination. And then the stakeholders or the participants in the consensus algorithm can be state and
right.
global non-state actors. Yet they retain their sovereignty because they can either withdraw from the usage of that
Right.
order or fork it.
That
Right.
so that's a very good example of fourth sector, right, where you are
Mhm.
creating this meta integration. And I think that's the most realistic because when you talk about network states and network nations, I mean definitely there is something going on. I'm not denying that people are self-organizing and wanting to do this and assembling money and that you know like at this stage which is like the network city stage, you can imagine some countries like Morocco or Tunisia and saying, oh, why don't you come here? And that attracts
Right.
money and knowledge. I mean, that I think can certainly happen. But given
That's
the
a digital
scale of
nomad version of
China,
it almost. Yeah.
right? Given the scale of China and Russia, I think we shouldn't rush into like utopianism about it.
No.
So it's going to be like a play of mutual adaptation for a certain time. And so I think this strategy is the best one, where And
Yeah.
so the
Thank
difference
you.
is the following. So
Hmm.
market societies in the West competing with state-centric societies, in the East Eurasian side, and then the BRICS with them. They want to. So the state is becoming stronger in Russia and China, not weaker,
Sure.
right? So
Of
you have to be
course.
careful to be realistic about what is happening in the world.
So this is
Uh,
what I wanted to get back to around this
yeah,
East versus West versus digital, right? So like the main issue that I see with that trichotomy is that the digital is basically dependent on the East and West's physical infrastructure, right? And
yes,
so that's a huge dependency. Uh, so again, this is why I think blinding the network level traffic between peers may be a way that you can um, reach netizens in countries that may not be
right.
able to access it
Right.
under
So then,
normal conditions.
as a relatively autonomous actor,
Mm-hmm.
these proto network
Mm-hmm.
nations. I like the word coordinations that was invented by, Primavera de Filippi and her crew.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a
Yeah, I'm
really
familiar
nice
with her.
word,
Yeah, it's a
coordinations,
great.
because it leaves it open to what exactly it's going to be. How, but they have a vested interest to protect themselves, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so this I think is inevitable, right? You as a kind of so okay, I'm not sure if this is a good analogy, but I like it. So okay, so 5,000 years ago we create
Mhm.
writing that creates a writing class, and they create a world to their image through markets and states. We can do their
Mhm.
accounting and their writing, and okay. Then today we have a new language, coding, and a
Right.
coding class, right, which has access to its computers. So that's their means of production, but they don't have access to the means of valuation, the
Mhm.
networks that would, because they're still controlled by corporations and states. And so naturally, if they want to create a world to their image, they're pushed to create, their own infrastructures and to do arbitrage and to protect themselves. And I think this is where crypto, is very important, to create all these things, because of course, I don't know what you think about this, but I think that in the West we're moving pretty fast to a Chinese situation in the sense of
Oh yeah,
surveillance,
100%.
control, and I actually tend to believe that so there's this woman, what's her name, Catherine Austin Fitz, and she says, okay, today the war. So you have a declining system. It
Mhm.
loses legitimacy. So you have a fragmentation because the integrating narrative loses legitimacy, right? So you have
Mhm.
fragmentation. Fragmentation creates polarization because if you're
Mhm.
alone, you're looking like, where can I find the most support, right? So this creates the pagans against the Christians, the Reformation against the Catholic Church, and I think today the
Mhm.
culture war. And I think the culture
Absolutely.
war today is two factions in the ruling class, and this is where the Jouvenel comes in. It's
Mhm.
always about alliances, jurisdictional alliances. So these factions are trying to get more strength by looking who can support us, in the people, right? And the
Mhm.
middle class, upper middle class, working class, rural. So they're trying to strengthen their coalitions. And so you have one coalition which wants to sacrifice the nation to the empire,
Mhm.
you know, the globalists, as the right
Yeah,
wing would say, and I think that's real. And like the
I
WEF,
think it's an
their
accurate
image
assessment.
is
Yeah.
the WEF. Their ideal is a world run by multi-stakeholder coalitions
Mhm.
in domains, global domains, but dominated by financial capital. The
Yeah,
black rocks of our world. And
a
then
managed
the other
democracy.
side,
You know.
yes, the other side is sacrificing the empire to the nation. So
Mhm.
this is Trump, you know,
Yeah.
allied to local business people, to the rural, to those who want to bring back industry and things to America, but they don't think they can continue to fund 800 bases abroad.
Yeah,
And
I think
you know,
like the
and
sorry,
I don't want to choose either side. I think either, they both have strengths and weaknesses.
yeah,
So I think that the commoners, this is how I think about it, is that the commoners, so the people who are self-creating these productive ecosystems that are partially translocal, we should first of all strengthen our own power,
yeah,
and then look at who's supporting our agenda. That's the way I think about it. So to not necessarily to choose sides, although I want to choose a side that gives me the maximum amount of freedom of speech and pluralism, and
sure.
I'm not sure what side is the best for that. I actually, increasingly tend to believe that the side that's in power now is doing the worst in terms of suppressing
Uh,
free speech.
yeah, I think like some of the populist movements we're seeing, or maybe nationalist movements, this sort of sacrificing the empire for the nation. Um, I think they have a lot of really important points for understanding or criticizing the current status of our empire,
Right.
right, or of our civilization. Um, but at least how I see it, it's almost this kind of this return to the single nation with a standard territory.
I
I
think
don't
that's
think is actually
ultimately also
viable against.
reactionary, right? Yes.
Yeah, it's a very reaction.
It's not a
But
future.
it's
It's
also
not
not.
a future. It's a way
No.
to react. Yeah, I agree with that.
So I think for that to be viable, there almost needs to be like some kind of transnational policy network between those nations, and to basically
Right.
create a counterbalance to a globalist. So like, the point being is like the stage is at the global level, for this iteration, and we'll probably. Depending on the timeline, it'll probably dictate how the world governs itself, right? And I don't know,
Right.
maybe we'll get some kind of um, you know, quasi utopian Star Trek military, government controlling the world, or I don't know what it's going to look like.
Right. Yeah, so
But I
that's
guess
what
that kind of
exciting. And of course, what they say in Chinese, may you live in interesting times, which apparently is a curse.
we certainly do.
And
Yeah.
so, we're going to have a lot of swings. I think we have to expect wild swings in politics, where, if you look, for example, at Republicans in the US and what they want to do if they win power, some of it is frightening, like closing the DEA. Closing DEI, I can live with that personally, but closing the DEA, maybe.
Mm,
So kicking out 50,000 people, on the first day he comes in office. I'm not saying I'm necessarily against it, but it's these are like destabilizing. If they do it,
yeah.
it's going to be very destabilizing. It's going to create massive resistance. Look at what's happening in Argentina, and with serious dangers of civil war in some countries, and
I was about to
especially I
ask
think
you
the
if you
U.S.
think a civil
is.
war would be on
Well,
the table.
I'm not predicting it's going to happen, but I certainly think that the danger is there, and there are
Hmm.
some of these scientific, institutes. I forgot the name. There's one in Scandinavia, and they're based on what happened in Bosnia and Yugoslavia, and so they have quite objective criteria, and they say like U.S. is 70%, right?
Right.
Which is it's not
Wow.
100%, but it's 70% of all the
Spicy meatball.
criteria which conditions the eventual outbreak. And this is where Europe now is not in a good shape. I think
Hmm.
it's being vassalized by the US and doing things
Yes.
that are counter to its own interests,
Interests. Hmm.
which, by the way, is also typical for the end of an empire. So as you lose control of the far abroad, you come back to your near abroad, right? And then you have to
Hmm.
hyper exploit your near allies in order to resist. So Europe is in bad shape, but Europe has a interconnected network of 400 cities with
Hmm.
long history, still integrated in their territorial regions, and that are very well connected to each other. So we kind of primed for a distributed. So if the EU or the nation states collapse, we have this kind of underlying, and you see the map of the Holy Roman Empire. It's very colored. It has like 80 different regions in Germany, and yet they all chose an emperor, and that lasts for 1,000 years. So that was like a very stable, relatively distributed system. The US
Mm.
has 40 cities which are not well connected except by plane. So the US is primed for regional breakup,
Mm.
you know,
Interesting.
and so that's maybe a good side of Europe is that we have all these, old historical cities where, convivially built, architecturally built, um, you know, eh, they're very pleasant, to live in. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I try to spend as much time in
I'm
Europe
European.
as I can.
I'm still a bit,
Yeah.
I'm still a bit patriotic. I think it's still, we have things that are likable.
No. Yeah, nice. Um, I guess so going back to these sort of like seed forms, we've talked about, the crypto as being a potential seed former and an evolution of uh, open source technologies and creating these public goods. Is there any other seed forms that you identify at the moment?
Well,
And
so
I
the
guess
two for me are peer-to-peer and the commons, and they
sure,
reiterate everywhere. Like, so
I
that's
see.
basically what my wiki is about. I have 25,000 articles per domain, business, spirituality, and you will see that everywhere the same thing is happening. These seed
Wow.
forms are emerging, but those are like the two common points.
I
So,
see.
so
I
that's
see.
why I say peer-to-peer networks based on commons, right?
Hmm.
So you
Gotcha.
need a common infrastructure for collective action. If you have only individual, then nobody
Hmm.
wants to invest in the things that we all need to do together to be stronger together. So that's why you need
Right.
commons, right? And that's why we needed states in geography, because otherwise, privately, why would I invest in a road,
Yeah.
that I'm using only
The
once a
private
month,
market tends to,
right? So the collective action
look at short
problem,
term gains.
right, which was solved by the state as a collective actor, um,
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't
and
thought about that. Yeah.
and so at the network level, we also need to solve the collective action problem,
Hmm.
and I think that's the commons and not the state.
Yeah. I can see that.
We have parastates, right? So you look at open source communities, they do have these for benefit associations, like the
Hmm.
Wikimedia Foundation and the Drupal Fund Association, and which act as a collective entity, to broker agreements between multiple stakeholders, right?
Hmm.
And crypto, for some reason, is trying to avoid human deliberation and go, to a kind of incentive-based consensus. And I still not sure if that's going to work fully, but I think where it makes sense is that it's the evolution of trust, right? So you have big little sister, little brother, tribal.
Hmm.
You can always go to some family member. Everybody's your aunt and your uncle, and everybody loves you. And you go, you solve problems through talking together, and maybe the elders. You have to go in front of the elders. Then we scaled up to empires,
Hmm.
right? So then you get big father. Like, why are we working together over long distance? Because we fear the same God and the punishments by the priests, right?
Yes.
Then we move to the nation state, big brother, because we're all equal citizens and the state is our big brother.
Hmm.
I think, somewhat controversially, we're now in big mother, which is, so because we are feminizing and 70% of the universities are led by women. And so it's for your safety, right? We're going to protect you. So it's like
Yeah.
benevolent surveillance. And
Yeah. It's
that's
almost
why
like there's
wokeism
now a
is essentially,
maternalism.
yeah,
Yeah.
and this is like a gender difference. Like this has been studied. Like 70% of the men would say we want truth,
Right.
and 70% of the women would say we want safety. We want to protect the weak.
Yeah.
So there's outliers in both groups, but like there's this general thing of value differentiation, right? And so that's why we now have censorship in the name of the good, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't critique minorities, and but it's very very repressive, I think. Like this like
Yeah, the
all the things you
intentions are
can't
good, right?
say.
But the
The
mechanisms and use
intention
to
is good.
employ it,
It's a
yeah.
protective intention.
But the
Um,
mechanism,
and
yeah, is
yeah, and so I think we need to go back to little brother, little sister, but on a distributed network, right?
yeah, absolutely.
And create smaller communities that can decide autonomously in their. So it's going from tribalism to neo-tribalism, not
Yep,
kinship based, but affinity based, right?
definitely.
And if you
I
think about it integrally, like Ken Wilber stuff, right? You might be familiar with that. So the idea of
a little,
transcend and
yeah.
include, right? So we have tribal, then we have these empires, we have the
Hmm.
eggshell revolution, which creates like communitarian systems like Judaism and Buddhism and Christianity. Then we
Hmm.
have the capitalist, entrepreneurial layer,
Hmm.
modernity, science, technology, postmodern layer, which is like we should be critical about our own and like see through our own determinations and anyway. And I think we need to kind of like take things from every system, right, in a new kind of integrative framework, a meta integrative idea. And so I work with Daniel Schmachtenberger and his team,
Hmm.
with people like Zachary Stein. I'm contracted to the Civilization Research Institute, and we talk about the meta crisis there, right? Which is the idea that so the poly crisis is we have multiple crises and they're all related, and you can't solve one problem without the others. The meta crisis is one step further. Is we are looking to generative common patterns that are seen in all these crises, and so if we can work on these patterns, then we can solve all the crises at the same time. So
Right.
I'm not sure they're going to succeed, but that's kind of the aim. And then what I'm doing, in that project, because that is not my specialty, is confronting this kind of systems theory, cybernetics theory with civilizational history, right? Because the problem with systems theory is that you have agents in a network. There's no subjectivity. There's no culture. There's no history. And I think for human beings, that is actually very important. So, like
I've come to the same
with
conclusion.
yeah, we're
I
trying to
realize,
merge, these two approaches in something that is like I'm not saying we're going to succeed, but that's that's what we're trying to do. And then the other thing
yeah,
I might want to
like
say, just I'll
just on
finish with
that
this.
note. Okay,
Yeah.
go, go.
Okay. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Uh,
I just want to say
just
I have another project that you might want to know about.
yeah,
Go
yeah. I
ahead.
mean, um, so on that notion of like trust, I think for me when I got into crypto, one of the selling points was this notion of like trustlessness, right? If you're one of the new priests, you can read the code and you understand how everything works. You can trust the mathematics, right? Of course, the average person can't do that, and so like they have to rely on social proof or heuristics to do that. But
Right.
um, what that actually was about, I realized later, was the erosion of a high trust society that I was embedded in, right? And like that sort of
Right.
part of the culture was actually what I was looking for, was this high trust society that I used to be part of as a child and in my youth, I guess.
Then what
Um,
what was your background? Where were you living?
in Australia, yeah. So,
All right.
but I've been traveling. I've been, digital nomad for probably the past sort of 17 or 18 years
Right.
now. So, yeah. Um,
Wow.
did they
Yeah.
find any of these before you talk about your next project or the other project you're working on that's interesting? Did they find any meta patterns yet, um, or are they still, trying
No,
to discover
they have
those?
some. I haven't really studied it that much yet.
Okay.
But like misaligned regulation,
Hmm.
social traps. So they use this kind of
I see.
vocabulary.
Yeah.
But my own project, which is to read all the macro historians, I can tell you it's
Mm.
like so much already that I have a hard time getting other stuff. So I'm really so I've read so there's three phases in macro history.
Hmm.
Well, I actually start with Spengler, right? Because he's
Hmm.
the first non-Eurocentric macro historian. So in the 19th century, everybody believes in progress, and Europe is the highest stage of progress. And so if everybody copies Europe, then then we're good, right? And Spengler is the first one, even though he was a conservative, to say, no, the West is just one of civilizations. It will also decline eventually. So there was a big shock. And so then you have a whole number of cultural historians, Carol Quigley, Arnold Toynbee, and they react and improve and critique Spengler, but within that cultural framework. With culture, I mean that humans have agency, that
Mm-hmm.
values matter, right? So a civilization for Spengler is like a very particular orientation to the world that is
Mm-hmm.
unique to that civilization. So he will say things like the Greeks, the body in space. So all their
Right.
sculpture is all about the body in space. There's no transcendence
Right.
in the Hellenistic civilization. It's all embodied. For the Christians, it's immediately when it starts the Gothic cathedral,
Mm-hmm.
infinity. For the Byzantiums and the Islams, which he actually puts together in some way, even though they're different. It's round, right? It's the protective dome. So
Right.
that's how so that's
Fascinating.
cultural. It's so every
Mm.
civilization has, he calls it the prime symbol. Then you have spiritualists' reactions, and that's Aurobindo, Teilhard de Chardin, uh, Sarkar in India. So these are people who say no, culture is actually also spiritual, and so they try to
Mm.
kind of like synthesize evolution and modernity with their traditions and their. Okay, so in the 70s, then you have a second layer, which is world system analysis. And
Yep.
these are basically the neo-Marxists, neo-materialists. So Wallerstein, and they look at geopolitics and productive systems, and which is also very interesting. I just see it as a perspective.
Oh.
And then the last one, which is still going on, is called Big History,
Mm-hmm.
which is the same as what Daniel is doing, which is looking at the patterns of change behind the world of matter, life, and human history. Right. So, for
Right.
example, emergence, bifurcation. You find them in nature, you find them in life, you find them in human culture. So but it's a big field, right?
Yeah. And a lot of history to go through. um,
Yes.
yeah. And was that your what was the latest project you're working on? You were going to
Oh yeah,
mention?
no. So this is
Yeah.
a so I this is a story. So I went to for the first time to Suzalu, Montenegro last year in April,
Oh yeah, yeah. I was there for the
and
ZK week. Yeah.
right, and then I
Mm.
I was quite critical about crypto and everything. I had
Mm.
my resistance, let's see, but I sat on a table, and there was a a climate denialist, so somebody who doesn't believe in climate change. There was
Get it?
an
Yeah.
impact investor, so that some people would call a greenwasher, and there was a deep adaptationist, collapses.
Mhm.
But the fact that they all could talk together peacefully on one table,
Yeah.
which is almost impossible now on social media and even elsewhere. Because why? They had a commons. The commons, they are building this infrastructure that will be good for all of them together, right? And so they can put
Yes.
their difference between brackets and focus on their commonality. And so that is the power of the commons. And so when I realized how community centric and common centric crypto was, I was
Mm.
more looking at the speculative and the criminal part and
Yeah,
all of
the
that, right?
outside face of it doesn't look particularly that
Yeah,
great,
yeah.
but like the
So
actual
then the next
core
step
and
is right. The next step is I gave my lecture there. I gave two lectures there, and there's some Chinese people, and they come to me and they're like, "Oh wow, this is fantastic! I never heard this story before." And so it turned out to be the Global Chinese Commons, which is a Chinese crypto nomadic network, because
Mhm.
crypto is mostly illegal in China. So
Mhm.
they become digital nomads, so they can do their work and then go back to their families and not do anything illegal in China, basically.
Mhm.
And and they said, "Oh, we're based in Chiang Mai." Uh, Wow. You know what? I have to
Stone's
go
throw
to
away. Yeah.
Montenegro to meet people who have their headquarters in Chiang Mai. And so I'm doing research coordination for the GCC as
Oh
well.
wow,
And
nice.
so that's also helps me a lot to, to become closer to the crypto world, because, I'm not a crypto person. I'm a person that tries to build bridges between
Yes,
domains, right? And so I'll know much less than you about crypto, but
sure.
I will still know more than a lot of people who are skeptical or don't know anything about crypto. And I can make bridges between different domains because I had a kind of varied and rich life, which put me in, many different spaces. I've been in technology. I created two startups. So I managed some SMEs. I worked for two multinationals, in strategy. I was a radical in my youth, and I was at the top of an international organization. I had a very intense spiritual search when I was young. So, I've done the Eastern stuff. I've done alchemy, and so, at some point, you are able to draw from different worlds that normally don't speak
Mm,
to each other, right? And that I can somehow translate more or less. So, I'm not saying I know everything. Of course, that's not the case. But when you've been in a world, right, you understand it better than if you're just like reading from outside, right? You have
yeah,
to interact with the
definitely.
people, understand the culture from the inside, and so after a while, that gives you something that a lot of people don't have, because
Yeah,
you
the
know
broader
probably
perspectives.
for
You
a
know,
good
you,
reason, because they were not as unhappy as I was when I was young. So I just had to do it, to search for like the solution. And then at some point you discover you're just as fucked up as everybody else. And then
I
it's
mean, there's
okay,
a lot of rabbit holes that I would have loved to, if we had more time to
Yeah,
like, delve into there, right? Like, particularly on the alchemy side of things, and I guess that's very occult adjacent as well. And I find that sort
yeah.
of
I've
topic
been a
very
Templar.
fascinating.
I've been a Mason. I've been a
Wow,
Rosicrucian. I wanted to
incredible.
know it all from the inside, and so I
Yeah,
spent some
but
years. This, you know,
yeah, I think like uh, Ethereum is. I've been on the inside for Ethereum for for basically the duration of its existence. And Bitcoin a little bit earlier than that, and um, it was almost like a quasi-religious experience for me in a way, because it was like the first time that I had found people who could actually hold different points of view in
right?
mind and have an intelligent conversation and non-judgmental conversation
Yeah,
about
that's so
different
important.
ideas.
Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
important. And so one of the things I learned from Zachary Stein, he talks about invisible colleges, right? So
Hmm.
when things are fragmenting and tribalizing and polarizing, and the people in the middle lose their influence. Like Erasmus was very popular, but once they started with the Reformation wars, nobody listened to him because he,
Right.
he,
Wasn't
he didn't really
on the
choose
fence.
a side, right?
Yeah.
So what you then have are invisible colleges, which is smaller groups, right, are going to protect themselves to be still be able to think and exchange, right? And
Hmm.
that by the way was the role of the Masonic tradition. That was where Catholics and Reformation and atheists could talk together, and different classes could come together without everybody else knowing that they were talking together. That's if you live in a highly repressive environment, that's what you need to do. And so I think that's, to a certain degree, we need to do this now, because we have no guarantee that we'll have free speech left in 10 years or so. It's I'm
That's why I work on the technologies that I do.
to
So
be
at
honest, like
least
on
the
Facebook,
cat's
I
out of the
quit
bag.
Facebook because I couldn't even share like scientific peer reviewed material.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
insane that and so I'm on Twitter. I think Twitter is more pluralistic, and it's not perfect, but it's more pluralistic. And if you can't do it publicly, you have to do it in smaller groups.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the
Yeah.
problem with crypto. Like the fragmentation, right? Which is like 500 Telegram groups for one thing. And it's like, oh god,
Well,
can spend
there's
day and night,
yeah, there's
and you still don't know like only 5% what's happening in a community.
yeah, like there's almost an interesting parallel with, say, the establishment of the United States of America, and the Federalist Papers in particular, where you basically had a bunch of anons, writing letters to each other, and regardless of the content, they were
Right.
fearful of British rule, and rightly so for some reasons.
Right. Of course.
And crypto is kind of doing a similar thing. You have these anons that are, and other political groups out there
Right.
being anonymous, publishing their information, like their
Right.
ideas, and then
Censorship
evolving their
resistant,
thoughts.
zero knowledge proof. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's necessary to protect these translocal groups.
yeah. I think,
Um,
like, in the
and
pursuit
and
of truth,
and the
you need
transfer of
that.
value,
Yeah.
I think, is very important, right? You like if you don't have capital, you can't win, right? If you're
Mhm.
living at the edges, and you cannot invest in the expansion of your system, you remain marginal. So the capacity
Yeah.
to transfer value, is also a crucial aspect of crypto. And you
Oh,
talked about
absolutely.
religion, right? And so that's also what I kind of discovered. And most people will be critical about it, but I think you need that, right? You need
I
something that
think so.
transcends your daily circumstance. And Viktor Frankl in the Man in Search of Meaning, which he was in the
Hmm.
concentration camps, right? He said only two kinds of people survived: the communists and the Catholics. The Catholics because
Mm.
they have vertical transcendence and they could, I'm going to heaven, and okay, so they could kind of detach themselves. And the communists because they had a temporal utopia, right, in the future. So I'm not saying both were right or wrong. What I'm
No,
saying
but
is
like
that
it's that
capacity
they
to
had the.
project yourself in the future is crucially important. And so what I'm doing, why I'm interested in cycles, is because the capacity when you are in declining phase to go beyond the declining phase, right? To look at the next upcycle and to
Mhm.
have sound ideas about what that next upcycle could look like, right? And so that's what I'm doing is like analyzing seed forms
Right.
and thinking like, is that working? If it's working, what does it mean? And can we deduce from that, like characteristics of the future system that are emerging?
So,
And
what are the different sort of scenarios that you foresee in the future, or like you think are likely, and can you
yeah,
pin
I,
them to
I have
any kind of
four
cycle?
worlds. It's like a four-world theory.
Hmm.
And there are four combinations of so centralized and global versus local and distributed. So they're not entirely the same, these two words, but I have only one quadrant, so I put them together. And then for profit and for benefit. So centralized for profit uses peer-to-peer and the commons in a fake way
Mm.
to extract from human cooperation. So that this is what I call net-archical capitalism. The Googles and the Ubers. And I think there's a shift in capitalism from commodity-based capitalism. I call it Marxist capitalism because there's an extraction of surplus value from human labor and nature to systems that directly exploit human cooperation. So they create platforms, we exchange and we work, and they tax us. So that we're back to rent, right? To
Hmm.
This is feudal. They're
Hmm.
not profit makers in the sense that they make things that they sell a higher price. They tax us, right? Just as a serf had to give half of his produce to be able to use the land, right? That's so even capitalists today are exploited by them because you have to give 30% of your profits in order to access the platforms, sometimes 70%. So then you have
Right.
distributed capitalism, which is libertarianism. And so
Hmm.
the idea is to make everybody in a small entrepreneur who can, autonomously make agreements and create and share value, but it's still kind of for profit oriented. Then you have urban commons, local, for benefit oriented, and the global open source world, right? So these are four different systems, all based on peer to peer and in different combinations. They all exist and they all compete with each other. And then,
Right.
of course, what is interesting is when you start having hybrids, right? Like crypto is evolving to incorporate open source, right? And what I want
Hmm.
is that crypto also incorporates the urban commons,
Right.
because then we
Well, I
have
mean, there
three
certainly
against
exists
one.
within crypto. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are.
I mean, they're all refi and all that. They're trying it,
Yeah.
but what I'm critiquing is the lack of connection between all the people who in the cities are doing renewable energy co-ops, and collective access to organic food, and real car sharing, and cooperative housing and co-housing, and they're not connected at all to the crypto world, and vice versa. And I
Yeah.
would so I wrote something called Crypto for Real, where I call for these alliances. This is what that's my particular point of view. What I would like to see.
That would be really nice. Yeah, for sure. Those ideas, like, were very prominent, like even early on in Ethereum's life cycle. And Ethereum has like a different sort of cultural affinity group around it than say the Bitcoiners do, right?
Right.
Which is also quite interesting to note that like these different public programmable chains or public chains have their own sets of behavioral characteristics, virtues and these sort of things. But um, I think part of we're taking a long detour because there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built and ensuring things are
Yeah.
scalable while maintaining the properties that we care about. And like that's why you don't really see a very large decentralized application ecosystem. It exists, sure, but like it's kind
Right.
of in a almost like a halfway house, like a Web 2.5, where you have,
Yeah. And the
you know,
interfaces are often like I mean, I use a wallet, but to be honest, I still find it very complex, and I
yeah,
often have to ask a friend, and we do screen sharing.
yeah.
Maybe it's
I mean,
my
it's like rebuilding the
generational
net
handicap, but
again.
I think it's way too complicated.
It is.
And a lot of the like publishing portals, yeah, there's still a long way to go. But
Yeah,
the thing is,
got to
it's
start
been going
somewhere.
on for you know it's been going on what, for 15 or 10 years. So the thing is, when Bitcoin goes down and the crypto goes down and you're still doing it, that's very important, right? Because that means that it's not just greed, it's not just
Yeah.
speculation. You really believe in it. So that's where the religious aspect, it's an ideology also.
Yes,
And
it really
we
is.
either have religion or we have ideology,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean it's true or false, but it's a way to make sense of the world, and it gives you need something transcendent, right? You need something that's beyond you. Because if you just
Hmm.
follow your feelings, Monday you like it, Tuesday you hate it. So
Yeah,
if you want to be
it's
committed
not
to
a
something, you
grounded
have to
rock.
believe that it's more than that. You have to be willing to make sacrifices.
Yeah,
And I think
well, I'm no
crypto has
stranger to
that.
that.
Crypto has that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I
I,
believe it does, and I feel that for a large part of that, I'm an embodiment of it. And these sort of bear runs. I really appreciate for this, for the exact reason you mentioned, that the people who are here for the right reasons stay, right, and they
right.
continue building, and they also continue building almost on faith because their
Right.
runway or their like the
Faith
amount of
moves
capital they have.
mountains.
Yeah, and I guess before we jump off, I was wondering, if there's any book recommendations you might have on some of these topics, particularly around cycles.
All right. Well, okay. You have Peter Turchin, Secular
Hmm.
Cycles, and he has a new book. I
Hmm.
I enjoyed Fourth Generation as well. Or
Hmm.
is it the Fourth Generation? I think so, right? That famous book about the generational cycle.
Yeah, yeah.
No, the fourth turning. I'm sorry, it's the fourth
There we
turning.
go.
Um, One book I really like is Kojin Karatani. It's called The Structure of World History, which is a really great summary of many of these thinkers, and doesn't really focus on cycles, but it's very good. So I have a section in my wiki called Civilization Analysis with very detailed overviews of all these authors.
Hmm.
I have a site called a page called Sources of P2P Theory, where I survey all the things that influence my thinking over the years. I have another one called "What You Should Read About the Commons," and maybe in the description I can send them to you, and you can put it in the description, and so people
Absolutely.
can.
Thank you very
So
much.
this is more than one book, but they can choose which book that appeals most to them.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you for spending the time with us. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
with pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation.